Okay, I think we have a number of our folks that we were expecting have joined us. So we're going to get this webinar started. Hi, everyone again. My name is Rich Overmoyer. I'm CEO at Fourth Economy. We are really excited to present this webinar today. Of course, we, like probably all of you, would rather never repeat the experience of the past year, but our team is really trying to make sure that we do learn from those experiences and really allow us to support even more effective assessment and actionable strategies for the communities that we support. Today, we're going to share with you 4 topic areas that we believe are important to consider as we all look to recovery and economic resilience. Next slide. One thing to point out while we're going through the presentation today, if you have a question, feel free to use the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'm sure you're all familiar with that at this point, as well as if you want to share an idea or a solution or something that you've been working on with everyone else that's participating, feel free to chat that in the chat feature. So I want to turn it over for introductions to Mickey.
Hi, everybody. Mickey McGlasson, Analytics Strategist at Fourth Economy. I'm going to be one of the presenters today. Thanks for joining us. Let me throw it, I guess, to Megan next.
Hi, all. I'm Megan Nestor, also an Analytics Strategist at Fourth Economy, and looking forward to talking with you all today.
Hey all, Chris Worley, Fourth Economy Analytics Strategist, going to be talking a bit about some of our remote worker data.
I'm Jerry Paitis, Junior Analytics Strategist at Fourth Economy, actually a VP.
We've kept our sense of humor despite the last year, and so I think we'll turn it over to Mickey, who's going to get us started.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. So I'm going to focus my brief talk today. We're each, by the way, going to do a very brief discussion on a specific topic. I'm going to focus mine on a phrase that everybody at this point is pretty familiar with, pre-existing conditions, except I mean that phrase, as we'll see here, in a slightly different way. I'm referring to pre-existing economic conditions. And what that means is I want to talk about how the effects that we're currently seeing during the COVID-19 recession might have been predictable based on the conditions that preceded it. On the next slide, we'll see a couple of snippets from different pieces of research and journalism that have sought to assess the effects of COVID-19. If I tried very hard, there is no way that I could succinctly provide a robust review of everything that people are reporting by way of the economic effects of COVID-19. But on the next slide, I just want to distill a couple of themes that we're seeing both nationally and in specific places across the country. One is that despite economic interventions like the CARES Act and ARPA and other federal, state, local policy, many people are still struggling severely from the current recession. And then the other is that women and people of specific race and ethnic backgrounds and low-income households are facing a disproportionate burden among those economic impacts. I suggest that neither of these things should be at all surprising. And I say that not just as a cynic, but based on indicators that were widely available long before anybody knew what COVID-19 was. A couple of those indicators, let me talk briefly about this first. So what we're looking at here on this graphic is a measure of households that report the highest level of difficulty paying their normal expenses from a survey product that the US Census Bureau has put out in response to COVID, the Pulse Household Survey. This data is from the most recent week available, so early March, the 2 weeks available. We see that still a year into the pandemic, over 14% of US households find it very difficult to pay normal expenses. We also see that Black-headed and Hispanic-headed households face much higher burdens than white-headed households on this measure. These numbers have been consistently about this high since they started measuring this specific statistic last fall. That's unsurprising to us, or at least it should be, because as we see on the next slide, there were any number of indicators that existed long before COVID that made it obvious that the economy was not as strong as some overarching indicators like GDP growth might have suggested. For decades preceding the current economic crisis, income inequality grew substantially in the US. In the period that immediately preceded the current crisis following the Great Recession of 2008, despite overall economic growth in the US, 1 in 4 counties saw an increase in their poverty rate over that time. And coming into the current crisis before COVID, these numbers on the far right column refer to 2018. About 35 million households in the United States out of 120 million total fell into a category that the United Way defines by this ALICE acronym, asset limited, income constrained, and employed, meaning that they made above poverty wages from employment, but below what we might call a living wage. If we go to the next slide, we'll see it's also no surprise that the effects that are playing out right now are skewed dramatically by race and ethnicity, because wage disparities and other indicators that preceded COVID explained that there was already a dramatic disparity among the workforce by race and ethnicity, as well as gender, among employed workers. So this chart looks at the relative average wage between white workers and Black workers across all states for which data was available in 2019. And in every single state, we see a dramatic wage disparity between white and Black workers. The same patterns exist for Hispanic workers and non-Hispanic workers, and for men and women. If we go to the next slide, we see a few specific economic challenges emerging during COVID, or the economic recession following COVID's outbreak in the US. Food insecurity, and what we're looking at here, housing insecurity. This measures the percentage of renter households who have rent due, who have no confidence that they will be able to pay that rent in next month, as assessed at the beginning of March again. 12% of renter households nationally that have rent due have no confidence that they'll be able to pay it. And those numbers are particularly high again for Hispanic and Black households. For the very same reasons as we looked at before, that should not be surprising. But it should also not be surprising because, as we see on the next slide, coming into the crisis, there was an existing affordable housing, a pre-existing, that is, affordable housing crisis in the United States. There wasn't a single state where fewer than a third of renter households faced a housing cost burden. That means paid more than 30% of their income paid more than 30% of their income in housing costs, which is the definition federally of unaffordable housing. There are two more quick statistics I want to throw at you on the next slide. Something you've heard a lot about probably are the labor force impacts of COVID. We see that unemployment has spiked across all groups, but particularly so by race and ethnicity for Black and Hispanic workers. On the final slide here, we see something that might be a little bit surprising, something that separates this recession from previous recessions. Unlike unemployment disparity by race, there has been a labor force dropout disparity by gender, wherein female workers are facing much higher rates of labor force dropout than male workers, which is uncommon compared to previous economic crises. Megan's going to talk a little more about that here in a second. But the point I want to call out here is that it's probable that the reason that we're seeing that is partly due to underlying wage disparity among employed workers preceding the recession, and that it's particularly pronounced, again, for Black and Hispanic workers. If we go to the final slide, I'll just wrap up here and turn it over to Megan. So that was not a particularly cheery series of indicators, but so it feels a little weird to close with a slide that starts with the word opportunities. But the point I want to leave you with is that what we have here is an opportunity for economics as a domain to learn from public health. Because in public health, we understand, as it says here on the slide, that we need preventative, in that context, medicine, in this context, policy that seeks to address the root problems and not merely treat the symptoms. I'll pause there and turn it to Megan for the next sequence of slides.
Thanks, Mickey. So I'm gonna, I also feel like it's funny to have a big smile on my face after looking at those slides, but I'm just excited to talk to you all about the pandemic's impacts on childcare infrastructure and how that kind of works together to impact women's workforce participation. So some of the stuff we just saw in Mickey's presentation. So we can go to the next slide. So even before COVID, we know that childcare was a critical component of our economy's infrastructure. There's lots of social, emotional, and developmental benefits that we know quality childcare has for children, but there are also important economic benefits as well. For example, in the Pittsburgh region, Allegheny County specifically, 14% of the labor force are working parents with kids under the age of 5. So that's over 90,000 working parents in the region. And these parents rely on childcare to allow them to be an active part of the workforce. But we also know that childcare has long had issues and challenges, and that's what we're going to look at next. So even before COVID, there were gaps in childcare capacity. And this particular slide is looking at Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh region, but we've done this analysis elsewhere in the country, and it really echoes trends across the country. So you can see, looking at the Pittsburgh region, that there are 45,000 kids under 5 who need childcare, and there are only 36,000 seats available childcare. So that's a gap of almost 9,000 slots, and this is again before COVID. And of course, if you've been paying attention, or if you know anyone who has a child or have a child yourself, you know that COVID is causing dips in childcare capacity. Go to the next slide, Claire. And this again is looking at the Pittsburgh region, but really echoes the trends that we've seen all across the country. So some providers have been forced to close permanently because of a lack of revenue. Others are operating at reduced capacity for health and safety concerns. So they have to make their classes smaller. Or they're at reduced capacity because demand is down. So some parents are keeping their children home or have changed the types of childcare that they're sending their children to because they're concerned about health-related things. Or some parents are no longer employed and so no longer need childcare. So demand is down and capacity is down. And then we also have temporary closures for when COVID exposures happen. So there's a COVID outbreak at a childcare center. Maybe outbreak is a harsh word, but if there's a COVID case, oftentimes the center has to close down or the classroom has to close down. So if you kind of add all of those red buckets up together, you can see that capacity could be down, it's 50% lower than pre-COVID capacity. And we already had this big gap even before COVID, right? So a big concern and something to kind of keep in the back of your mind is, if more childcare providers continue to close as funding's impacted and decreased capacity leads to more funding concerns and more closures, what happens when the economy, sort of reopens? We're not just going to return to pre-pandemic conditions, which already weren't good enough to serve every child who needed it. And so this issue is larger than the pandemic itself and could have some real consequences for the economy. So how is this lack of childcare impacting the workforce right now, and how might it continue to impact the workforce? We can go to the next slide. Well, many parents are leaving work altogether to care for their children. So estimates say that between 12% and 19% of working parents are leaving the workforce, 12 to 19% of working parents, because they have childcare challenges. And besides impacts to the labor force and shortage of workers, which is a huge problem, this also has impacts on state and local income taxes, right? It has impacts on employers as they lose money because of turnover costs. These losses are impacting communities and businesses, not just parents and children and families. The next slide shows, again, something that Mickey talked about. Women are disproportionately impacted, and particularly Black and Latino women are disproportionately impacted. And that's because they often bear more of the responsibility for childcare at home. I won't harp on this one since we already talked about it a bit. But the next slide. So what can we do about it? We go to the next. Yeah, thanks, Claire. There's a number of things that we've seen really working that can help to support the childcare infrastructure. So we can continue to advocate for increased public funding. COVID relief funds are coming in and they're great and are going to help to temporarily stabilize the system, but aren't necessarily sufficient for long-term success. So we need to invest in systems to ensure strength and long-term stability. We can encourage employer engagement and action in this issue. So companies that offer childcare assistance see large decreases in employee absences and turnover. We can continue to build and support the early childhood workforce, 40% of whom are women of color. These are critical workers who are underpaid and lack access and opportunities for professional growth, which means turnover is really high in the industry. And then another thing we can do and have seen work is supporting non-traditional childcare, like small businesses and home-based providers who are really critical, resilient part of the landscape. So I hope what you take away from this presentation is that childcare has forever been a critical worker support, and the pandemic has only elevated how crucial it is and exposed these existing cracks and weaknesses. But by working in your respective communities to understand the unique gaps and needs of your community, to recognize the inequities in access to quality childcare, and to engage leaders in partnerships to support the system, I think there are a lot of opportunities to build the system back even stronger than it was before. Thanks so much. I'm going to pass it over to Chris.
Hey, thanks, Megan. So today I'm going to be talking about remote work. As we know, industry and occupation mix determines the ability for workers to work remotely. For example, those working in food and accommodation industries are unlikely to work remotely, while many in industries like finance and insurance may have the ability to do so. Likewise, occupations like computer programmers or accountants are more likely to be able to work remotely than someone, say, employed in a material moving occupation or like a grocery store clerk. All told, the Bureau of Labor Statistics found that an estimated 42 million workers nationwide, representing about 28% of all workers across the US, could work from home. We use this data to downscale their survey and fit it to a national model for each county across the US. And depending on industry and occupation mix for a community, the concentration of workers who are able to work remotely generally ranges from about a quarter of all workers to a third of all workers, depending on the community. One last thing to note while we're on the slide, we've done a ton of interesting analysis around our remote work data set, including looking at deployed broadband internet, matching up the ability to work remotely with typical internet speed for users. But the analysis that we're going to take a look at today looks at remote work and changes in commuting. It's pretty awesome. So let's look at the next slide. This example comes from the Tri-County region in Lansing, Michigan, home to Michigan State University, also home to a hospital system and emerging insurance and technologies industries. The analysis here matches data for the ability to work remotely that I just talked about and couples it with commuting data, both work and home locations by industry of worker provided by the census. What we look at here is we examine shifts in commuting patterns and changes in daytime population. In the analysis for this region, there's a visible shift in daytime population away from the urban core, which is where the traditional employment centers are, and into suburban and rural areas as a result from increased remote work during the pandemic. The map shows pre-pandemic to post-pandemic change in daytime population. Areas in blue on the map are those that gain daytime population, which means instead of commuting in to work, folks are working from home. And areas in red on the map are areas that lose daytime population. Overall, the three county region sees a loss of 5,800 workers, or a loss of 5,800 in daytime population because of less inbound commuters. The losses are most concentrated in the 6 zip codes in the urban core, where there's a loss of 20,500 workers, representing a 14% change compared to pre-pandemic levels. And why is this important? This analysis reveals the potential geographic impacts on spending behavior, especially in restaurants, retail, and services. And that's what we're going to take a look at in the next few slides. So fewer commuters could result in a loss of demand for restaurants, retail, and services in the traditional employment hubs. For example, remote workers aren't buying coffee on their way into work. They're not having lunch with coworkers, and they're not dropping off laundry at dry cleaners. And we know that Main Street small businesses are the most at risk. In these 6 zip codes in the urban core, there are 2,100 Main Street small businesses with $184 million in monthly sales, employing 14,300 workers. So what does the shift to remote work mean for these businesses? If all workers who could work remotely do work remotely, these 6 zip codes would see a shift of commuters of 20,500, a loss of 14%. If we assume that that loss is the same as the decrease in sales, a 14% decrease in sales would mean that these small businesses would lose an estimated $25.8 million monthly in monthly sales. This demand decrease could impact up to 2,000 workers using a sales per worker estimate from the economic census. So some key takeaways from our remote work analysis, opportunities and actions. Broadband internet is now an essential part of the current economy. It's going to remain essential for participation in future economies. Dialogue's important. It's important to engage larger employers and chambers of commerce to understand specific regional worker dynamics. And something also to consider is that remote workers and entrepreneurs are going to need targeted supports, and remote workers are going to need, may need retraining or new HR policies designed around them. And then something to kind of pair with this analysis, as new economic supports and funding rolls out, recognize that small businesses are impacted in downtown and commercial cores, which may be magnified by a loss in commuters. And really, you should consider developing strategies to create new activities in these areas. I think that's it for me. I'm going to hand it over to Rich.
Great. If somebody can start my video, that'd be great. Thanks, Claire or Monica. Yeah, well, let me present the final piece here. So as we've been doing this work in all these communities throughout the country, one of the areas that we've been looking at is really what are the industry impacts that are going to last beyond the pandemic. And so there's a variety of areas that we've been looking at. Certainly things like manufacturing, what the future of downtowns looks like, the eds and med sector, all seeing significant impacts that we think are going to have a multi-year effect on communities. I just wanted to highlight a few things, and we'd be happy to share more at a later time, but a couple of the areas that we've been looking at. The first area is impacts on travel and tourism. Obviously, with the restrictions that were in place over the last year and continue in many places, we've really seen significant impacts on the travel and tourism sector. You're seeing here in the center that the unemployment rate increased to 35.9% at one point in 2020, and almost a $500 billion loss from the industry in the last year. And that continues in many places. Although we are seeing in 2021 that places that have drive time tourists are starting to open up again. And so you saw last year a push towards outdoor recreation, a lot of outdoor types of experiences that people can do. And even a shift to more place-based venues embracing their outdoors. So you see music and symphonies and other performances outside. We're seeing that's helping some communities, but overall, if you look at the estimates from industry associations, we're still thinking there's going to be as much as a 50% decrease in rooms being booked throughout the country. Again, there'll be pockets of opportunity, but that's, nationally, there's going to be continued impact that we're seeing. Next slide. Yeah, and these impacts are universal. So if you look throughout the country, every region is being impacted in some way. And so there is going to be a long-term impact. I think to Megan's point, Mickey's points about the workforce as well. I mean, we're seeing a lot of areas that are bouncing back right now are struggling to retain or retract the workforce that was once there because of issues around pay rates, issues around the support ecosystem like childcare that are no longer in place to support people coming back to work. Next slide. The other thing that I know many of us are talking about is the migration that's been happening. There's a wide range of estimates that exist right now, anywhere between 9 and 15 million people moved in 2020. That data is still coming in, and we continue to see that as something that's happening in our communities. Most of that followed previous migration patterns. So if you see this chart from the National Realtors Association, you see the red is what was happening in 2019 and blue in 2020, and you really see a lot of the same patterns. There are a couple of notable exceptions. One is Ohio, actually, that was losing population and in 2020 was able to gain population as a result of the pandemic. We recently did a webinar in a top 10 ranking of the most livable remote cities with our friends at livability.com, and Columbus, Ohio was our #1 winner. And I think the variety of reasons that's sort of driving this behavior of where people are migrating to. You see on this list places like Texas, even though Austin has been attracting population during the pandemic, you're still seeing people migrating out of the larger cities and more expensive cities. And so the next slide, we'll kind of talk to what's driving some of that behavior. The first area is affordability. I think when we looked at folks that have been moving, and this is the work that we've done, that Livability did through their survey, and we presented with them recently. You see this in other surveying as well, that affordability has been the driving factor of why people have been leaving places like bigger cities in California, certainly New York City, and other larger cities around the country. And a lot of times they're moving not necessarily out of state, but even into the more rural regions of their area. And so we're seeing an interesting pattern that's forming. And the question is going to be, is this permanent or is this a temporary move that's occurring at this point? Next slide. The other thing is this remote workers. I think even though we're seeing in the surveying that people are moving because now they're free to work from wherever, they are still choosing locations that are easily accessible to larger cities. So having a good, strong airport and accessibility to that airport is something that's critical as people are thinking about location. So as regions and communities are thinking about promoting themselves as a remote ready community, I think stressing the access that you have to other locations through their airport or even road infrastructure are going to be critically important. Next. And then space. I think, again, larger cities, more dense environments. I think, for the last, 10 years at least, we've been seeing folks rushing into, the core urban areas and doing more of that. I think in the last year, obviously, we've seen a shift in that folks are looking for more space. Kind of goes along with the affordability. They're looking for areas that have, bigger access to amenities, both within their environment, but also nearby, so that they can go out and recreate in the outdoors. And so you're seeing some communities, throughout the country that had not experienced the population increases in recent history. That because of that, the ability to have more space, affordability, and support remote work, that you're seeing people move to those locations. So I think there's some opportunities for community leaders to think about. And again, with our friends at Livability, we really looked at, thinking about, the long term, do you have the quality of life and quality of place in your community? I think really being authentic. We've also seen a number of communities trying to latch on to this migration and pretend to be something that they're not. We coach against that. I mean, I think also thinking about the social infrastructure for some of these communities. Some places that are on this list of places that have been benefiting have not had, a large number of people moving in, and so may not have the social civic infrastructure to support people coming to their community. And the final slide, I think in terms of the opportunities that we see going forward, again, this is just a couple sectors that we've looked at for this presentation, but I think there's some things like the downtown experience. I know a lot of our core downtowns are struggling and probably will be for the next 2 and 3 years. I think, really thinking about activating downtown for both your region and also bringing in visitors from afar. I think certainly business related travel. And so the tourism, a lot of those pessimistic numbers about tourism are related to the fact that people probably aren't going to be doing business meetings or business conferences in a lot of the larger cities. And so that's something to think about. What can you do to activate and to support the businesses that rely on that business traveler, because they are going to be struggling. In supply chain, I think we didn't have enough time, but manufacturing supply chain continues to go through, a lot of strains. I think in terms of opportunities exist around onshoring or reshoring, but overall the disruptions in the supply chain, including the most recent one that we've been seeing the last couple of weeks in the canal, are really straining this manufacturing supply chain and causing manufacturers to think about the proximity of their tiered suppliers. And finally, yeah, I think there is an opportunity to make way for movers. And so that's something that I think, every community should take stock of what they have in terms of their core assets. Again, be authentic, but think about what that experience is like for people that are looking and wanting to move to your community, and make sure you're putting the best foot forward. So I think that concludes our lightning talks. I think we've have some questions in the Q&A as well as in the chat, and keep sending those and also sharing your ideas. So I'll turn it over to the folks on my team that can answer some of those questions, and we certainly thank you for your participation. Team, who's ready to answer some questions?
I can dive in. So one question that I saw in there was, are there examples of employer on-site childcare or with a consortia of employers? Yes, and I know a lot about the particular region we're in, Pittsburgh. So, UPMC and Sheets both have, which are obviously large employers, right? They have, they reserve and subsidize slots for their employees. PNC offers emergency on-site childcare. So if a child is sick or they need extended hours and can't use the regular childcare, a parent can take them to on-site childcare. That being said, I think most of the examples I know of employer on-site childcare are large companies. So, I just want to make the point that there are things that medium and small businesses can do as well if they can't invest in something like that. One of the most important things they can do is to talk to their employees and see what they need. I think a surprising number of employers have never surveyed their employees or found out what kind of childcare they utilize and what kind of supports their employees need. So that's kind of I think a basic but really important first step. Small businesses and medium-sized businesses that can't afford to subsidize childcare or offer things like flexible spending accounts, savings accounts for childcare can also, put enforced meeting times in place so that you're not overlapping with times when children might be home. So there's all kinds of great strategies out there. We're actually working on a website right now that's almost live. It's going to have much more specifics about how businesses can support childcare and support their employees. So feel free to shoot me an email and I can send that along to you once it's live. It should be up soon. Does someone else want to take a question, and then I'll come back to my next one? So I'm not, yeah, okay. I see Chris.
Yeah, always, childcare is the darling of all these presentations. There's several questions about remote work and broadband deployment. Some of the things that you all have been noticing, at least through the questions and through the chat, are some of the same things that we've been seeing. Rural broadband remains a issue. There's just not incentives enough incentives for private companies to develop rural broadband. Hopefully that's changing on the horizon. Other conversations around a digital divide, especially in sort of historically underinvested areas. There's a few things that we've been looking at that compares some redlining maps to now broadband access for communities, and look at things like new digital redlining where there haven't been investments in areas that have been historically redlined. And last mile delivery of broadband is still an issue, and all of these issues are hyper local. So it's not an easy fix to get broadband right, but it does take a really specific and localized effort, backed up by large federal and state dollars to get it done.
I see one question in here from Kim Lear, asking if are we thinking this recovery is going to be K-shaped? And if so, what are the long-term impacts of that? Yeah, absolutely. I think that, and I think we're already seeing that even throughout 2020, that you do see this dichotomy of, folks like us, like consultants and others, right, are able to work at home. We kind of didn't skip a beat. We obviously adapted to what was happening. You're seeing that throughout industry sectors. I mean, construction's bounced back. Anyhow, a lot of sectors have immediately kind of pivoted and adapted to what's happening. But then at the same time, you're seeing a lot of the frontline retail, hospitality, in those areas that I think, you're seeing businesses that are teetering on closure, and thousands of, not tens of thousands of businesses that have closed throughout the country. That's going to leave a permanent impact, at least permanent, being a relative term, but I think at least over the next number of years, 4 or 5 years, you're going to see a lot of issues around business closures, vacancy, and then obviously the resulting loss of employment from those entry-level workers, which is, obviously trying to be mitigated by the federal government with the various recovery programs and stimulus programs. But in our analysis, we're not, many places that's not going to be enough. And so I think there's going to have to be a concerted effort to those folks at the kind of on the downward slope of that K, that they are at risk. And that vulnerable population, as Mickey talked about, is something that as, economic developers, as community leaders, I think we all need to be thinking, what are the strategies to help them recover in the short and long term?
I can answer this question at top. Do you see childcare slowly getting back to normal once the economy opens? I think ish, with a couple of caveats. I think one thing we've seen is a shift in, so parents and caretakers want all sorts of different types of childcare for their children, and that hasn't changed. And I think that we'll continue to see people wanting lots of different things and having different needs. But we have seen a bit of a shift away from larger childcare centers towards some of these smaller providers. So I think supports for them and helping them to be successful and helping get families connected to them will be new. I also think a lot of providers have shifted away from I've seen a lot of providers shift away from serving infants. Infant care is a lot more expensive than serving older children. And so there are some concerns that there's going to be kind of a real gap in serving babies. And that's kind of a concern of even when things kind of return to normal. The other thing I would say is I certainly don't think normal is good enough. So even if things, I think we've seen fewer businesses close than we originally anticipated because some of the stimulus money has helped to support them. But I think that businesses already were just struggling so much, and childcare workers were struggling so much, and families were struggling to find childcare. And it's been such a challenge and such a barrier for so many people to kind of enter and participate and continue to participate in the workforce, even before COVID, that I sort of see COVID as a bit of an opportunity to say, like, yeah, we don't really want to go back to normal. We want to go back to better. And we want to make sure that the system is really stable. Now everyone sees how important the system is, right? And how important it is for the economy. And so we want to, be building it back to a place where it's stable and it can withstand any kind of economic shock and can help support even more families and workers. So that's my soapbox, but that's a great question. Thanks for asking it.
I think there's one in here, Rich, that maybe you and I can kind of riff off each other, that says, what do you envision or predict for large single employer commercial properties in city centers? How will they be impacted by shifts to remote work? Maybe there's a few things that we've seen the downtown partnership and others?
Yeah, absolutely. We're working in a number of markets right now that are struggling because I think everyone's trying to figure out what is going to be the decrease in headcount from some of those larger employers. And the numbers are all over the place, but you have seen not just tech companies. I mean, some of the California tech companies are saying pretty much everybody can work remote, but they're continuing to hold on to their office space. In other places, you've seen, manufacturing companies like Ford announce their 30,000 of their people can and choose to work from wherever going forward. And those decisions will be managed by their upper management in terms of like what that structure looks like. And so I think I think downtowns are going to have to figure out sort of what is a strategy going forward. And I think certainly in a lot of the markets that we've seen is the opportunity around workforce housing is there. I think there is some conversion opportunities that we all need to be thinking about because a lot of those folks that work in those downtown office buildings are in need. There's some of the people that are the vulnerable folks that Mickey had talked about in terms of the housing issues that we've seen in terms of affordability. And so I think if there are stimulus programs or infrastructure programs that can help support conversion of office to housing, I think we're very bully on that kind of approach. But it also means to think that downtown organizations or economic and chamber organizations need to think about how do you keep downtown activated with other events, right? So I think, if you have 30-40% less workers, that doesn't mean all is lost. I think you just need a different strategy for how that first floor retail, restaurant, and amenities get supported with other dollars coming into that community, into that area.
That's right.
Some of that.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of some of that conversion or development of housing in those places, we've seen through some of our analysis in the places that have, places that are traditional work corridors, but also a lot of people live there. The move to or the shift to remote work kind of muted the overall change in demand for the restaurants and services in those places. So places where you can live and work and play are still going to be really important, but maybe that area is a little bit smaller than what we were thinking about before when we were talking about those kind of areas.
Yeah, and somebody asked about micro manufacturing in downtowns as a revitalization strategy. I think that's certainly a possibility. I think we've seen groups such as like LISC, I know, has been working on this in Indianapolis area and really thinking about manufacturing within the neighborhood environment. I think the question of downtown, at least in the couple of communities we're in, is whether or not that building footprint allows, for that in terms of the structure. And a lot of downtowns are pretty built out that there's not existing buildings to support that. But I mean, I think that doesn't, especially around the fringe, I think we're seeing in a number of those markets that there probably are those opportunities to explore. And because of technology and this pool to kind of reshore activities, we do think that that's a viable strategy to consider for your location. So yeah, I think that's something to think about, but bringing together your commercial real estate as well as your manufacturing folks to have that conversation would be critical.
I want to add to that on the technology side. The advent of additive manufacturing and 3D printing enables manufacturing to go into spaces it hasn't normally been in before. May not fit so well in a high-rise downtown building, but the National Center for Additive Manufacturing, America Makes, is located in downtown Youngstown, Ohio.
Yeah. Chris, there's a lot of broadband questions. I think that a number in here that I think we may want to cover. I think certainly some questions around broadband connectivity in rural areas and really taking the need for collaboration between government, private sector, and utilities. Have we seen an uptick of that kind of activity across the nation? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, certainly there's been interest around it. And with some of the new stimulus coming out, I don't have the figures in front of me, but there are kind of earmarks for broadband deployment in a part of that. One of the things we're kind of looking out for and I'm a bit concerned about is, this coming up right now and this past year is sort of like the biggest moves. So if you don't have deployed broadband, which is necessarily for remote work, are the places that don't have it going to receive any of those 15 million workers that Rich was talking about? So that's kind of an issue. One of the things that that we're really interested in also is we think that remote work could be here to stay. So so we look at that when we look at both remote work and learning from home. We know that both access and reliability are problems. So we talk about that with communities that we're working with. But yeah, I think there's definitely an increased interest in broadband because it provides remote workers with an ability to work from anywhere, but it also is essential for things like healthcare access and other issues. It's just an underlying condition for people to participate in an economy right now.
That's great, Chris. There's also a question, or I guess a question in here regarding, I guess President Biden is going to be in Pittsburgh today announcing at some point, announcing his infrastructure initiatives. It's something that, I think obviously the federal government's been talking about for quite a while in terms of additional infrastructure investments. I think the question is like, how can that help make improvements to underprivileged populations and communities? I think that's important consideration. I think we've seen some early language around programs like a kind of modeled after the Conservation Corps, really a kind of a job opportunity training program to get folks into those areas that are going to produce the infrastructure. I think that's something that I think all of us as community leaders need to pay attention to. And I think, understand sort of what is that existing ecosystem in your community that supports folks that have not been engaged, say in traditional, either the trades or any kind of construction, any kind of building area, especially those that have been in those vulnerable occupations like in retail and hospitality. I think there's going to be a need to start transitioning and helping people transition into those areas. I think the key is going to be making sure that the timelines match up, right? And I think that's in the past when these things have been attempted, I think there's this rush to do certain things, and again, you're still leaving a lot of vulnerable populations behind. And so I think we owe it to not be back in this situation in the future years by thinking more strategically about how we connect the dots for people and get them into those jobs that will be created by what could be a massive infrastructure investment. Looking if there's any questions we haven't answered, or now's your chance. If you want to get one in, you can certainly chat at us or put it in the Q&A. I guess team, do we see anything else we need to answer? It does not look like, it looks like we've checked them all off. Great. So we really appreciate everyone taking the time today to join us in this webinar. We've been excited to do these. Obviously, thanks for those who were able to share some information about your community in the chat. And I know, feel free to send us additional information. We're constantly looking for promising practices. And also being able to share what we're seeing in communities throughout the country. So we're happy to engage with you and, share what we can. And, this is unprecedented time that we're all going through in our careers, right? And so I think the more that we can share with each other models that are working, ways that we're approaching the issues that we're tackling in our communities, the better off I think we all can be. So we appreciate you all being part of our network. We hope to continue to engage with you in the future. We will send you a follow-up with recording this webinar. And again, some of the additional links that have been posted, we'll make sure that you have those as a resource going forward. And if you have ideas about future things that you want us to talk about or want to know about our perspectives, please send those as well along to engage@fourtheconomy.com, and we'll be happy to host a next webinar with the content that you suggest. So thanks everyone again, and have a great afternoon.